Welcome, and Kim, over to you.
All right, thank you, Lisa. And welcome everyone. Hi, I'm Kim Box, and I'm the chair of the NACD Northern California chapter. We have a very exciting and outstanding panel for you today to discuss the ramifications of the diversity deficit on your boards and in your companies. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor of today's session, Heffernan, which is an independent insurance agency. It's employee-owned, but what I like most about it that I found out recently is they give back 22% of their profits to charity, which is just blows me away. It's outstanding. I'll be back at the end of the session to remind you of upcoming NACD events, and we would love to make this hour as interactive as possible, like Lisa mentioned. So turn on your video, put any questions you have in the chat box, and we'll be bringing those on as we go. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Nora, and she'll start introducing herself and the panelists and get us started.
Great. Thanks, Kim. And welcome, everyone. I'm joining you all. I'm on the board of NACD Northern California's chapter, but I am joining you from the other side of the United States, which feels like a different country in Florida. But we'll get started today. Our topic, as Kim mentioned, is all about what are the liabilities for our boards that have what Kim just called a diversity deficit. And we've got an all-star panel today. I'm really thrilled. I'm sure you read the deep bios that are on the web that we posted, but joining me today, if you want to wave, will be Priya Huskins. She practiced corporate law with Wilson Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati. She's now a partner and a board member of Woodruff Sawyer. And we also have Dr. Ayanna Howard. She's over there. She's in my upper right. She is a board member of Autodesk, as well as she's a company founder, a book author, and then in her spare time, she's the chair of the Georgia Institute of Technology School of Interactive Computing. So she's an honorary Silicon Valley member. And then finally, he's at the top of my screen in the Mr. Brady spot, is Joe Talmadge. He's a D&O insurance expert, and he's currently at Heffernan, who's also today's sponsor. So welcome to our panel. Now, Priya has texted me that something big is going on where she works, and she's going to have to drop off early. So what I'm going to do is direct my first questions to her, and then if you see her disappear, you won't know why, but she has to disappear. One other thing I wanted to mention, we'll keep it very interactive. If you have a question or a comment, just flood them into the chat, and the moderator and/or Danielle will call on you, and you can have your question. So Priya, two things are going up at the same time, the D&O insurance rates and the number of D&I lawsuits against boards that don't have enough diversity neither on the board nor in executive management. So as a lawyer, tell me what's going on here, and more importantly, why?
So thank you, Nora, and it's great to see so many friends that I know before and perhaps some new friends today. So diversity suits, I think, are super interesting, and to fully appreciate what's going on requires a little context. So first of all, it's not just technology companies, it's not just Silicon Valley companies. By my count, we have 8: Cisco, Danaher, Facebook, Gap, Monster, NortonLifeLock, Oracle, and Qualcomm. And some of these, but not all of these, were named in a June 2020 Newsweek article. Does anybody get Newsweek anymore? That's really not the point here. But that article listed the 20 largest US public companies that have no African-American board members. So some of these companies were on that list, but certainly not all of them. Now, the first 5 were all against California companies, mostly tech companies, not the Gap. And then you got Danaher in Washington, which is not a traditional technology company. And so, there was a little bit of an evolution, and I'm going to come back to that because, again, the first few were also all filed by one guy at one plaintiff's firm. And I bet if I said the name, you wouldn't particularly recognize them. But 2 of them more recently, the one against Danaher and the one against Cisco, were filed by the plaintiff's firm Robbins Geller. And if you don't recognize their name, let me just tell you that I basically said boo at midnight on Halloween. That's a very serious, professional, scary, and wildly successful plaintiff's firm. And they're on record as saying they would like to see billion-dollar breach of fiduciary duty settlements. So when Robbins Geller comes to play, they don't go home easily. And that should be a concern. So when this was a bit of a quixotic effort by one guy at a law firm, they're serious, you have to respond, but Robbins Geller getting into the mix takes it up an entire notch. The other thing to note is that the 8 that are here so far, and I do think there will be more, because it's very easy to sue a bunch of directors. This is not a hard thing to do. One of my jokes is if Woodruff Sawyer lets me go, I'm probably going to become a plaintiff's attorney because I wouldn't be able to sleep. My soul would be shattered, but it's a very easy job. Not so easy to be successful, but it's easy to file suit. And one of the points I want to make here is that not every company who gets sued is similarly situated. And not to pick on them, but let's just use Oracle as an example. Oracle is going to be one of the harder suits. There's going to be more legs on this one. And the reason is they are already in the middle of a $400 million settlement with the Department of Labor over having systematically underpaid minorities, right? So it's one thing to have these diversity suits when the only issue is the board. It's another to have a diversity suit, to have the specter of that come up when there's lots of other stuff that the plaintiffs can put together and say, see, this is a pattern in practice. Let's stay on the Oracle complaint because it's quite instructive. It's similar. The other ones are similar, including Robbins Geller. So what the plaintiff's firm did is they went to the website, they took the pictures of the 14 board members and they printed it in color, right? And what could you automatically see of the 14 board members? There are no Black people on the board of Oracle. With Safra Katz, the CEO of Oracle, there are 4 women board members and 1 male South Asian board member, but there are no Black board members. And the plaintiffs asserted a variety of allegations. And I think the most important ones are the breach of fiduciary duty suit allegations, which were quite broad. But I would draw your attention to the acting in bad faith claim. That is a breach of the duty of loyalty, and that's not indemnifiable by a corporation. So you can immediately see, right, the plaintiffs are going for blood. There's also an unjust enrichment claim, which is basically, hey, all these people got stock and other compensation tied to financial metrics, but they were acting in bad faith that whole time, so give that money back. And then just to round it out, a federal securities law violation, because as you know, you cannot distribute a proxy statement and solicit votes, including just your normal annual process, with any misleading statements in it. So what are the misleading statements? Like a lot of other companies, Oracle has made statements like, we care about diversity. And what the plaintiffs are alleging, and I would just read one of these if you have time, you don't have to read them all, they're very simple. What they're alleging is, you said it starts, we believe in diversity and it starts at the top, and yet there's really, the allegation is there's just no evidence of that. Nora, let me also mention some of the demands, because the demands are, and again, you can almost do a bingo game in terms of like which one has which of these demands, but some of them are really quite startling. Resignation of founders as the chair of the board, replacement of 2 or 3 board members with African-American board members, replacement of a chief diversity officer with somebody who's of color. That's coming up if the chief diversity officer is, of course, a white person. Directors being asked to give back their compensation. Creation of enormous funds ranging from $700 to $1 billion to support hiring and promoting and mentoring of diversity candidates. And this now includes employees. Publication of a diversity report. My personal favorite, replacement of the external auditor. Feels like a bit of a non sequitur. It has to do with controls. And I'm trying to describe this in not an overwhelming way, but I do want to say one more thing, Nora. And the question I think is worth asking is, why were boards even talking about diversity in their proxy statement? We all, as board members, have seen these proxy statements get longer and longer. But I just want to remind you about 2 things that kind of set up the situation. Remember that in 2018, Larry Fink, CEO of BlackRock, right? So arguably like the avatar of capitalism, put out a letter, and the letter said, hey, everything else isn't working out. governments, etc., corporations, tap in. We're going hard on the S for ESG. It's my expectation that our companies, so basically all of their investments, will care about the S in ESG, which was really a clarion call around these kind of diversity issues, DE&I generally. And a little bit startling. I mean, as a corporate securities attorney, I'm a bit like, wait, don't investors care about shareholder return? But if for many people, your biggest investor wants you to talk about diversity, you're going to talk about diversity. The other thing is, remember that in SK, it's SK 407C, there is this disclosure that's actually required. And it says, concerning the Nominating and Governance Committee, you have to disclose whether you consider diversity and in what manner. And so you have this sort of ripe situation where there is information in the proxy statement that now plaintiffs are, it's shooting fish in a barrel for a lot of companies. And I don't mean that disrespectfully. It's just that I think in some cases, marketing and other well-spirited people have kind of gotten into the disclosure and perhaps moved it from accurate to aspirational. Does that help, Nora?
Yeah, it helps a lot. So you talked about the proxy statement, of which all of us have put, diversity on the SK. I'm going to pick on Autodesk for 10 seconds. Autodesk does disclosure on their website that's incredible. It's 3 or 4 levels down. It tells you the hiring class, what minorities, underrepresented groups are. It's got it by management, by technology. I thought it was phenomenal, and I'm sure they've won awards for it. So my question to you as our lawyer to get advice is anything we put on our websites for diversity, does it need to be auditable, like by our financial auditor, as well as are we then liable if a company's got 10% Asians and it stays 10% for 3 years, we're liable to these kind of lawsuits?
So first of all, I'm not your lawyer, so just as a reminder, disclosure. Please consult your actual counsel. But Nora, let me break it up into a couple buckets. First of all, are you liable as a director for being sued based on disclosure on your website? Absolutely, yes. But the liable part is tricky there. This is the United States, greatest country in the world. And one feature is that you can be sued at any time for anything by anyone. So maybe not the best feature of the whole deal, but it is part of it. So I bring it up because there is a sense in which if plaintiffs decide they want to sue you, they will find something. And so while we don't want to put things on our website that are egregious commentary, that's really not the show here once you get within the realm of kind of reasonable. But now we need to ask the question, what's reasonable? A formal answer, Nora, is plaintiffs will routinely bring any public statement into a complaint to prove or disprove an assertion that was made in a more official channel, like a proxy statement or something like that. So the broader answer is, yes, you must make sure that there is accuracy, which put differently is a real bummer for the people that are trying to make your disclosure, readable and happy. So that's the push and pull of the lawyers. The second order question, though, is there actual liability? So not are you going to be sued and have to pay defense and all of that. And that's why we have D&O policies and indemnification agreements. The real question is, how far is this litigation going to go? And that is the trickier thing. So let me tell you about 2 reasons why I think that's so tricky. The first is there is a series of cases in the Delaware court, and most companies are Delaware incorporated. And if you're not, your state of incorporation looks to Delaware. There's a series of cases that seems to be not changing, but further enhancing what Delaware will consider to be a good lawsuit brought by a plaintiff on the question of duty of loyalty. And in this context, I'm talking about good faith. And remember, duty of loyalty issues cannot be indemnified. This, the final settlement cannot be indemnified. So a lot of pressure on insurance that I'm sure Joe will talk about. So the series of cases, some of you have heard of the Marchand or Bluebell ice cream, but there's also Clovis Oncology and Candy Technology. It's a series of cases in which the Delaware court is refining what does it mean for a plaintiff to be able to bring a good oversight suit. And all of these diversity cases are fundamentally saying there were statements, there were grand pronouncements, and the board did a poor job of overseeing what was being said and how it was being said. And so this series of cases and the legal, the ins and outs of those cases aren't so important, but it does get to the question you asked, well, what's on the website? And so I'd put it like this. You will not win your motion to dismiss. You will be in litigation longer to the extent that plaintiffs can do a good job saying either there was no system of controls in place on a particular issue, or if there was some system of controls, the board ignored it. So now take diversity. Theoretically, if I'm arguing for the plaintiffs, what I'm saying is, either public company board that has no minorities on their board, either you weren't looking or you looked and you ignored. And that's why those pictures are so damning, right? So if you have a board being sued and there is this allegation of there are no minorities, it's not actually going to be helpful to have a couple women but who are white and call it a day. It doesn't look good. Now, no court has ruled on this. We don't know how it goes, but Nora, I think this is why I have more than the normal amount of low-level concern that I would typically have for suits like this. There's other stuff going on. The series of cases I mentioned, in particular, proxy, that tell me that a well-pled complaint has more legs. And one more time, if Robbins Geller is coming to play, they don't waste their time.
Okay, interesting. There's a question from one of the attendees, Rich Haran, has for you. And then if anyone else has any of the legal questions, please tee it up now, because as I mentioned, Priya is going to disappear. So Rich, do you want to ask Priya what your question is?
Yeah, Priya, I was just kind of curious because, you mentioned that some of these lawsuits are specifically talking about Black directors. And, and I don't want to focus on one, but I'm wondering what level of granularity do you think that these lawsuits are going to go? Like if I had a board that was 10 people, 6 women, 3 Asian, 2 Hispanics, but no Blacks, am I looking at a problem? Or if I was a Black beauty company that all women of color, at some point, does this become someone going, you know what, this is another, because you're talking about diversity, but you're not. I mean, how this cottage industry of lawsuits, where do you see it sort of going? And what do we do to protect ourselves to consider?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I don't think there's an immediate threat of any lawsuits being filed against boards that are all Black women. That's really safe zone right now. That's not how these are going to play, because part of what the plaintiffs are looking for is to be able to threaten companies with bad press. Like, it's just not a good day to be on a board and say like, oh, we're being sued for a lack of diversity. Rich, one of the notable elements of these lawsuits is some of them mention the George Floyd Memorial Day events. They don't all mention that, but they are all focused on African-American board members. And, very specifically, one of the lawsuits actually says very specifically, you got an Asian guy on the board, but that's because an investor put him on it, not because you were trying to increase diversity, which is just a ridiculous and offensive statement, actually. But for clarity, on the Oracle board, there is one, I think South Asian. So I'm doing the thing where I'm looking at the picture, so that feels awkward. But it looks like there's one South Asian board member, and that doesn't seem to matter for who's going to get these suits. These suits seem all, in the short term, are very focused on looking at a lack of African-American board members. That's the specific thing that we're seeing for all 8 of these suits.
Okay, Priya, I know you have to run, and maybe this is for Joe, but for you as well, how alert, I don't know what the word is, but private companies.
Yeah.
Are they in jeopardy as well? And Joe, if you want to jump in, and I know you've got I know we're overstaying our welcome, but go ahead, Priya, and then we'll turn to Joe.
Sure. So private companies have a different set of factors because they don't have the proxy statement proxy statement in this context situation. But private companies are as subject to breach of fiduciary duty suits as public companies. So private companies tend to have a lower level of disclosure about things like diversity and all of those kinds of comments. And so the opportunity to say you said something and you lied is just not there in the same way. But to the extent a private company is very enthusiastic, and Woodruff Sawyer, so my firm, we're a private company, we're 100 years old. I am on our board. We have a bunch of women. We have no African-American women, and we absolutely made all kinds of statements over the summer about our support of diversity. Really hoping we don't get sued over them. But here's one of the differences. We just made comments about diversity. The longer a company has been saying we care about diversity, it starts at the top, with no progress, the bigger the problem. So those of you that just made a statement, you probably have like 18 months to pull it together. And I'm being a little silly, but that timeline is a big part of the way we're seeing these lawsuits sound.
Super. So that question was from Don Proctor. Don, was that answered? Is there a follow-up that you had on the private companies? If not, all right, then we can open it up.
Thanks, Priya.
Nora, I'm just going to say one more thing that I
Please
think
do.
might be helpful, if that's all right.
course.
One of the questions that I usually get is like, will these be successful? And let me just make this observation. They already are. These are already successful because 100% of public company nominating governance committees, okay, not 100%, but surely everybody who showed up to this call today, they're asking themselves, like, where are we? What have we been saying? Do we, can we actually support any of these statements that were being made? And in a lot of ways, that was the goal, particularly for Bottini and Bottini. It's completely obvious that they were using the cudgel of litigation to make sure that major companies were doing what they said they were going to do. And so they've been very successful. But it would be a mistake to think that all they want is like, oh my God, you're so right, and we're going to try harder. That's not the game. And so I want to bring your attention to the recent very large settlement that Alphabet, so Google, has agreed to pay to settle their #MeToo suits. It's $300 million, albeit over 10 years, that needs to be put into a fund that is going to support basically diversity initiatives. And my concern as a practitioner in the area is that 300 million may now be, is it the floor for the settlement that some of these plaintiffs may want for this? Now, I'm not saying that that is necessarily going to be the case, but it is not helpful to any of the defense attorneys trying to get rid of these cases for a low dollar settlement that it happened to be the case that Alphabet happened to settle something that isn't the same, but kind of rhymes in the ESG space. And so that would be the reason that a board member would go from, I'm concerned because I want to do the right thing, to, do we actually have a financial liability here?
Right. Very excellent. Thank you, Priya, so much for your time. I know you have to run. It's a great segue then to Joe. As I mentioned up front, is our D&O rates seem to be going through the roof. And D&I is one of the reasons our brokers are saying that could be why. So I'm wondering, when you're thinking about D&O insurance, what are the D&I factors that you factor in when you're calculating risk, which ultimately turns into rates?
Yeah, thank you, Nora. And first of all, I'm sad that Priya just dropped off. I was going to tell her if Woodruff ever let her go, we'd hire her. She wouldn't have to become a plaintiff attorney. But to answer your question, there's a lot of factors that go into underwriting D&O, and there's tons of data that the D&O underwriters will look at, and most of it, unfortunately, is based on historical events. So, we're in an environment where nobody has a crystal ball to determine what the outcome of these recent derivative D&I events are going to ultimately be. And so when you go through the renewal process, the underwriters are looking to the individuals who are leading this company and presenting themselves to the D&O underwriters to make sure that you're addressing these issues in a meaningful way. And so I think we're in a challenging environment because a lot of what has happened in an already stressed D&O market is just completely unknown on a going forward basis. And so to the extent that you as a board and as executives that are presenting to the underwriters are addressing these issues in a meaningful way, I think that that is a very big deal. They're obviously going to want you to protect your balance sheet. They're going to look for you ensuring that you have adequate access to capital. And as Priya mentioned before, ESG and the S of ESG matters when it comes to access to capital. And so those are things that I think a D&O underwriter very much cares about. And then you go to the disclosure issue, all of these underwriters are going and looking at your disclosures. And so to Priya's point, if you're making statements, when you go through the D&O negotiations, these underwriters are wondering, well, how well are you following through with these statements, and how deep do your metrics really go into the organizations? And it's a very challenging position to be in, because on the one hand, the underwriters are waiting for data to come out to see how they want to price this. But at the end of the day, they're going to price based on the profitability of their books. And right now, on a historical basis, it hasn't been great for the past couple of years. And so we're seeing that in the pricing. I think ultimately, if you're going to the table to negotiate D&O terms, your underwriters are looking for best-in-class companies with best-in-class risk. And guess what all of the best-in-class companies are doing? They are addressing ESG, and they care about the S and ESG. And so if you can communicate that in a meaningful way to underwriters, I do think that they will price accordingly. You're on mute.
And I made an incredible comment. You missed it. It's a great segue into Anna. Dr. Howard is on, as I mentioned, the board of Autodesk. And so Joe just mentioned the S of ESG. And it's clear to me that Autodesk got the memo, because when I look at Autodesk's board, and I've followed it for years, it's 50% women, 10% Black. And as I mentioned, as I looked last night, scrolling through the diversity statistics, it's very, very forthcoming. So the S of ESG, how is it handled on the Autodesk board? Is it spread among committees? Is it an active conversation? How did Autodesk end up this way?
So kind of two answers to that.
Okay.
One is DEI in general is spread not just as a full board initiative, but also in audit, in gov, as well as in compensation, right? And so it's not here's a diversity officer, they're going to address it. It's like, no, this is integrated in every single function. And so it changes the conversation. So that's one thing. The other thing is that they were committed before, the requirements came for gender diversity. They had started doing a conversation. They had said, look, diversity is going to be part of how we evaluate the board and the board composition every year. We're going to have this. We're going to try to figure this out. And so that was the first step. And then they did it before basically the current one, where you have to have Black, Hispanic, or some underrepresented minority. Before that was even, again, like a requirement. They said this is something that's important. And I do want to say that a company that thinks about this before they're required to, it says a lot about the company itself. I just want to say, if you look at Autodesk stock, as a measure, you could look at what it was right before I joined, and you can look at it now, right? And that's not because, it was me. It was a company that's thinking about being innovative and kind of getting outside the box. That's resident within their products, is resident within their structure, is resident within things that are going to happen. And so it's just a sign that other things are going on that are amazing. And so DEI is, I would say, it's that the canary in the mine. If you see a company and they add someone on their board, you're like, where did that person come from? Look at that company more.
Look more closely. I see what you mean. It's just a shining example of it. Let me see. There's a Jen McClure had a question about SB 826. Jen, can I call on you to tee up your question?
Yeah, thank you, Nora. So there's another deadline coming up in January where the bar gets a little bit higher on compliance with 826, which is the number of women on boards based on the size of the board for public companies in California. And there's still many companies out of compliance with the last deadline, although there has been a lot of progress made. I was wondering, because the last speaker said that all the litigation is focusing on people of color on boards and that level of diversity, isn't there any litigation focusing on compliance with 826?
I'll ask you, Joe, do you happen to know on 826 litigation? Oh, you're on mute now.
No, I don't actually know the data points on the 826 litigation, but that would be a real, actually, I bet you Priya would actually know the litigation results on that. I think from an underwriting perspective, the data is always going to be historical in terms of how they're pricing your D&O. And I think a lot of the issues that we're seeing today in terms of how they want to look at your companies, that litigation is going to bleed out on the performance, the underwriting performance for the underwriter. So that's going to be known information. I think in terms of positioning yourself going forward, it's really looking at the class of company that you are. And so even though these are very specific metrics, X number of women on the board, X people of color on the board, really those ideally should be manifestations of something that are much bigger in terms of your operational perspective on ESG and how you're running the company. And I think as you go out into the market and negotiate D&O terms, you can tell when a company cares about this stuff, and you can actually see it in the performance metrics. And so that, I'm not saying that data isn't valuable, and it is probably going to bleed out into the performance of the D&O loss performance. But I think that there's a bigger question here, which is all of the potential fallout from not addressing these issues that Priya just went through a whole bunch of them.
Yeah, it's certainly a big risk. So Joe, when you go in to assess a company, what's your best advice on how boards can mitigate the risk? So what do you see? Most of us, I looked at the roster, are from tech companies. Is there a dashboard you look for? Is it hard for you to find the information? What advice would you give tech companies to avoid litigation in this area and to lower their premiums, by the way?
Here we go. Yeah, I think care about the risk, first of all, like legitimately care about it. Don't be AB 979 is here and you have to address it, and there's going to be penalties if you don't. But I think if that's the question that you're asking, you're not asking the right question, right? Do you actually care about this as a company? And is it something that you want to see live and breathe across all of your committees? And are you actually measuring these metrics, and how deep do you measure these metrics? Because I think if you start asking those questions, you start to see some behavioral change at a much larger level. And from a risk mitigation standpoint, you want to go and identify those things, measure those things. But if you're doing it on a very methodical, measurable basis and doing it very deep, then that will come out in terms of the company performance. And I think that is felt in a presentation to a D&O underwriter. And the underwriters, insurance companies are dealing with these issues themselves. So they're looking internally, and they're dealing with the same challenges as tech companies. And so the same people that are underwriting your risk are also dealing with that risk. This is not something that they're not thinking about. And if you're not talking about it or doing something about it, then I think that you're behind the ball in terms of getting the best terms and conditions. And the other thing too is, Priya talked about these non-indemnifiable circumstances, and side A is traditionally has been easier to get in the market, and that's for the coverage for non-indemnifiable claims. Well, guess what? The two things that are most commonly cited for side A insurance are derivative claims and bankruptcy. And guess what's been happening the past year? Both of those things. So, if you combine an already stressed D&O market and increasing claims in the side A side, you don't have a really great environment for buying insurance to protect Ds and Os. And so I think more than ever, because the side A is particularly impacted, it is very important to address these issues, because that's what Ds and Os have historically relied on as sort of the golden protection, was that side A coverage. And that's being threatened right now.
Okay. So Ayana, let me go to you. So you're on the audit committee of Autodesk, and you're also on other boards. Are there, so for the risk of culture risk as well as D&I litigation, et cetera, is there a dashboard or is there some best practices we can learn from you? It doesn't have to be Autodesk specific. I don't want to pick on you for that, but what are your thinking there in terms of managing that risk?
Yeah, so just like with any type of risk you think about, cybersecurity, what's the risk of cybersecurity? What's the risk of, employee retention? What's the risk of activism? Diversity is a risk. And if you think about lack of diversity, the risk is basically sort of the same thing. There's the loss of employee morale is a risk. There is your brand and reputation. If you do get, maybe the lawsuit doesn't go through, but you will appear in the New York Times front page, right? That's brand and reputation, which is really important. And then even your investor dissatisfaction, if it's like a BlackRock, they are committed to this and you're not compliant, that's also a risk. And so you evaluate the risk. It's not like it's a special category. You evaluate the risk. What is the probability of this risk? Is it a high level risk category? Is it a low level? Is it a yellow green? And then what are the controls you put in to make sure that you can either mitigate the risk or you don't even enter into that risk zone. And so you treat it just like any type of risk that you have.
So in terms of, do you have any favorite director questions that you ask on your boards to really try to assess for yourself if you're at a risk of a Me Too or a risk of, you saw Google where they walked out and they were demanding board seats that employees get. Board seats, and Priya just talked about what, 300 million that they have to pay out as a settlement. How do you know as a board member, I'm sure you probably we all see the annual survey, and we have management saying, they've done a great job, but do you have any special questions or favorite questions you ask to kind of understand it better?
Yeah, so one is, I would say globally sentiment. And it's not just the employee sentiment, but it's also employee sentiment about the company and their place in the company, which is always a sign. It's about how do you think the world views the company from the outside. And so it kind of teases out a little bit of those things. The other thing we ask are, what are the metrics? What are the measures, right? So what are the actual measures? What is going to be done to move the needle, or what is going to be done and what's the timeline? So very concrete metrics for evaluating whether this is something that's working or progressing or not.
That's great. As you were talking, it reminded me of some of the best practices I saw. I usually sit in the boardroom and somebody presents yearly the annual survey. Now the board members take all the comments and then they're able to use search facilities through the comments and search for words such as harassment, just trigger words, or count how many times certain words come up. And so it's really, it used to be we put our noses in and our fingers out, but now I think it's more trust but verify to try to see. We also read a study where one of the leading indicators of a Me Too incident is no diversity at the middle layer of management. It's just got a higher correlation with a Me Too incident. So that diversity number really matters, but it's not just the E team, it's the director level and above. So there's some things you can do that are highly correlated with it. I think, was that Glenda? Someone had a question on the rates of insurance. Oh, it's Kim Box. Kim Box, do you want to ask Joe about?
Well, it sounds very tactical, but really it's kind of a bigger question. I think of the good driver discount, and it seems like right now everything's going up for everyone. And I'm wondering if you possibly see over time how companies that are extremely progressive start getting, incentives or I guess kudos or whatever you want to call it, the right metrics. And I'm wondering this because obviously because it would be less costly, but also it's just, I love how wagons are being circled right now. You have AB, the bill that just passed in California. We know that even the bill that passed with women on boards, it affected the whole nation. Everybody started looking at it. Everybody started talking about it. It created new discussions in the boardroom. And so anyways, it's just more of an encompassing question about behaviors and metrics and how we incent people.
Yeah, I think it's an amazing question, Kim. And, I guess the short answer is yes, I do think it matters. I don't think it's as direct of a sort of underwriting metric as you would want it to be, where, you know, hey, we've done X on DEI initiatives, and, you know, can we get X discounts? It's not like that.
Yeah.
But I can tell you that it is 100% something that underwriters are concerned about, especially on the side A side. And also there's some really, really cool insurtech products coming to the market that is taking all of the publicly available data and trying to slice and dice how we're looking at management liability risk and quantify these what used to be relatively subjective risks, you know, in and around morality and social issues, and trying to do a better job of quantifying that stuff. And I would not be surprised if at some point down the road we had some sort of social quantifiable measure that was coming in to supplement the D&O underwriting side, because, and I've seen products on the private D&O side that are already doing that, where they measure social behavior at the executive level to try to incorporate into the D&O underwriting process. And it's important to them because it does impact D&O, but it also impacts how you treat employees and, you know, what you're doing for compensation. And so there's wage and compensation issues associated with that. And, you know, these underwriters do D&O, but that encompasses other line items of management liability that impact underwriting performance for these companies. So I can tell you, just even on the innovative side of insurance, that companies are looking to quantify more and more these sorts of behavior so that they can basically be more profitable.
Right. It's very interesting. And I think that probably the rate started going up because of the unknown before there can be, you know, then over time we see what the impact is. And honestly, all this information today is very interesting. I don't think anyone a year ago would have ever predicted that we would be having these conversations in this way. So thank you.
No, it's interesting. And one of the things that when Ayana was talking, it touched on, I was meeting with one of our large investors the other day. I'm sure you all knew this, but an entire cottage industry has arisen in machine learning and AI for stock screening. And they're really screening on ESG. And so, because I'm on a tech company, obviously people, we don't really have important machinery. We don't have anything except our people and some IT products. And they screen us on it, and they use it as a screen because it is a leading indicator of our longevity, because 80% of our stock is held by long-term investors. And so they are using D&I. And I said, well, how do you, then it comes back. That's why I was asking Priya about, there's things we do put in the proxy. And then like Autodesk, there's things that we might tweet or we put on our website, and they take all the available information, they've crunched it down, and there's a direct correlation, especially for companies without, we're not in mining and metals and things like that, heavy machinery, we're really in the people business. And they realize that if we can't attract and retain incredible employees, and we're not treating them well on the S side, that we're not a good investment. And so back to your point, Kim, as well as Joe was making, is that they're trying to quantify the unquantifiable. And I think, and this is Dr. Howard's area, with AI and ML now, they're able to actually number crunch. So Sustainalytics is one of them. There's about 10 or 12, to me, they're Gartner groups, if you will, of are these guys sustainable? So my big ESG lesson was, don't boil the ocean on all of E and all of S and all of G. Pick the 3 or 4 that are most meaningful for your company, because your largest investors are screening those things out with their AI models. So I don't know, Ayana or Joe, if you wanted to comment on that, but that's what that comment sparked in my mind. And then Glenda.
So one of the,
go ahead, Ayana, please.
Yeah, so I guess one of the things I do want to say that I think right now the metrics are loose. People are still trying to define it. I think that's going to change within a year, without a doubt. And the thing is, though, is that we have to worry about who's establishing those metrics. If we're not all part of the conversation, then it'll be established by individuals that it may not be in the best interest of our company. And so I think it is worth having a conversation for the community to figure out these metrics as a unit versus having, an investor group say, these are the metrics and, you better comply.
So again, from you, it's really self-governed before you get governed, or you will get governed. Let me ask you this, Anna, and you don't have to speak for Autodesk, I don't want to call them out, but are there bonuses, long-term or short-term? Do they have an S component to them? Some people call it a non-financial metric. Are people rewarded inside companies that you know of for the S component?
So I do know of some companies where they do reward, but it's a bonus, right? So it's not a negative. So if you don't meet your goal, it's not like you get deducted, but if you do, you get a little increase, which seems to not have the same type of impact that you would think. And I think, Nora, you gave an example at one point. I think you might have.
I did a deep dive. I had a compensation committee on a Fortune 500. So I had to do a deep dive into metrics on the S of ESG. And some of the things I concluded, so I just read every proxy known to man and in tech. And some of the things I concluded was S was the most prominent thing that people were judged on in technology. Unlike other industries, mining and metals, for example, they had a lot more on the E side of ESG. The S came from technology. And just like you said, it was a modifier. It wasn't the thing. So we've all been GMs and CEOs, and there've been big financial metrics, and we follow those like, we just put our head down and grab those metrics, but it was a modifier on top, up to 10% discretion. Either way, if you met certain goals. Most of the goals were not specific. So it didn't say like, you need to get this underrepresented group to this percentage by this date. However, there were some outliers. For example, Verizon said by a certain date, 60% of its US workforce would be women. And they also mentioned an amount of money, I think it was over $7 billion, that they would spend with third parties that were women and underrepresented group owned. So they were an outlier in the sense that they put a specific measurement and you could math problem it and say yes or no. Most others, Intel, for example, or IBM was interesting because they used negative discretion the last time that the short-term incentive was evaluated, and the discretion went downward on their short-term bonuses due to some organizational, they were a little vague on exactly what organizational and what thing. So those are some of the things that I found. The last point is, it seems to be in the larger companies now. So it's about half of the Fortune 500 have, I don't really like the term non-financial metric, but it's a non-financial metric, and they're in the short-term bonuses. Only about 20% of the Russell 3000 had those in there. So I don't know if you have other questions. I just had to become a geek on metrics because I got the task at our board, and so I'm working on it. So I think I saw a hand from Glenda. Is that true, Glenda, or you were fixing your hair? Either way, so go ahead.
I actually had a question I was starting to ask of Priya, but I think it can pivot to Joe. And it's just going back to these lawsuits that were filed in the summer. Have there been any examples of boards acting on the guidance? And they are, like, I'm in the middle of, on one board I'm on right now, and we've been doing, board replenishment, and we are actively seeking African-American directors to add to the board. And that had nothing to do with a lawsuit. We were just working on it in the post George Floyd situation. So I'm interested in whether these plaintiffs are actually interested in change, or if they really are using it as an excuse to game the D&O system and get proceeds in some manner. Or can you tell if it's a genuine desire to drive diversity, or if it's an opportunistic thing to drive D&O payments? Hopefully it's
Yeah.
not harder.
Well, it's a very good question, Glenda, and so thank you for asking it. I think at the end of the day, I'd be guessing if I told you the motivations of the plaintiffs are. But I think there is some interest in. You have activists, obviously, where if you're not doing what you should be doing, you're a potential target. That's a risk. The plaintiffs bar potentially could be pushing for diversity, or they could not be caring about it. They might just be seeking, monetary benefits. But and there's also some discussion about the constitutionality of these laws, right? And so even on the backdrop even on the backdrop of these questions on motives, on constitutionality of pushing these issues, I think there is a larger dialogue that is very real, independent of those things, and that is the fact that you perform better with more diverse perspectives. And I think, at least on the D&O underwriting side, if you're looking at a company and you know that the best-in-class companies are going to have more access to capital and are going to have less employment issues and less risk, you're going to price that differently. And so you can sit here and go backwards and forwards on all of the data in and around whether or not this is going to come into the actual loss runs of the underwriters, and that will all play out in the next 2 years, and we'll know exactly what the numbers are, and the D&O underwriters are going to price that way. But on a forward-looking basis, you're in the middle of one of the most challenging. I've been doing public D&O since 2001, and so now we're here 20 years later. 2001 was a dot-com crash, and you couldn't get coverage anywhere. I mean, it was just as bad as it. Yeah. So.
At the time.
Yeah, exactly. So we're in the middle of a very tumultuous D&O market, and if you're looking backwards to see what happened and try to guess, what the numbers are going to be from a claim standpoint, you're not in a good position. And I think the best thing you could do if you're a D&O is just to do the next right thing for the company, which is, yeah, exactly.
Well, one follow-up on that, and this may be a Priya question, or Nora, you may know, but I'm also interested, the SEC is kind of sitting silently on the side. California is, we've got AB 979 and SB 826. Where's the SEC in all of this? Like, where is the actual legislation that says, or guidance of the exchanges that says, this is, they say a lot of things about what makes for a lawful control of a company, but they're silent on this. And I think that's, it's really interesting. They'll stipulate how many audit committees you're allowed to sit on if you're on the New York Stock Exchange, but they don't say anything about diversity. So the question is this going to turn into actual, as Joe, you were alluding to, actual legislation that creates a standard as opposed to something that's driven by plaintiffs?
Yeah, anyone in the audience know where the SEC, I know they were thinking of things along this line, none of them that came into fruition for this proxy season. But if somebody out there is closer to the SEC than I am, I'd love for you to either raise your hand or just take yourself off mute. And it does seem they are uncharacteristically silent. ISS is starting to chime in a bit, as well as our investors saying that they'll vote against the NomGov committee and all the members on it, et cetera, if we don't conform to some of these. I also know on the case law, and we need a lawyer again, is most of the companies I'm on were Delaware based, but we're headquartered in California. So the question is it really legal on this litigation? Not that it isn't the moral thing to do, not that it isn't the right thing to do, but the question is, could you actually win a case where it's headquartered in California, but it's Delaware law? And I'm not sure any company is going to stand up and say, I'm not for this, but I don't know legally if you can really, I don't know, Joe or Ayana, if you know.
I do have a comment on that, Nora, because there are a lot of questions in and around these issues. And if you ask an underwriter, what they're going to tell you is, well, we're going to see how it plays out, and so they're going to take that perspective on underwriting that risk on a backwards looking basis, right? So it's going to come out and come into their underwriting performance once it's all said and done. But that doesn't help you from a forward looking basis. So.
Yeah, interesting. So I want to go back to like a diversity elite company, like many of you represent. Ayana, how do companies link then do you have a separate employee strategy from the strategy of the company, or how are those things linked together? How as a board member do you guys handle that?
So they're highly integrated. So a lot of the employee strategy is based on one, surveying the employees, figuring out kind of what's going on, where are the things that are breaking, what's wrong. I will say that one of those surveys did lead into thinking about diversity at the board level in terms of Black Black and brown directors. It came from surveying the company, surveying the employees. And so that information is then directly integrated into thinking about strategy, thinking about transformation, thinking about the next step that the company wants to pivot, because you can't pivot without employees that are willing to pivot with you. And so those are definitely integrated.
Okay, interesting. So it sounds like the diverse elite companies, they have culture and employees are embedded in the strategy. It's not a separate. I see that. I'm on a board in Sweden and we had an ESG report and an annual report. And now we have one report and this is our company. So I'm wondering if we're learning that the S in ESG is just part of the strategy. It's just a piece of it. Olga, I think you had your hand up, unless you were batting a fly. So I don't know.
No, no, I did have my hand up. I'm Olga Botero. Probably many of you do not know me. I am Colombian and I'm sitting in Colombia, South America, but I do sit on a publicly traded board in the US and another 2 publicly traded boards in Chile. So Nora, I'm a little bit like you, which is kind of international boards. And another one and then I advise another 2 in Ecuador and in Peru. But the question I have for the DNO is I'm very confused. Because in my board in the US, it's all about the S. In my boards in Chile, which are 2 utility companies, it's all about the E. And in each of the different companies I'm sitting on, there are different DNO. And I don't really know how to go back and ask for specific things for the companies to review on our DNO, so we are covered on the right letter of the ESG. And Nora, I think with what you were just saying, probably you're suffering the same thing in Sweden and in the US. So how should we do about that? What are the things that we need to ask depending on the specifics that company have to focus on, either on the E or the S or the G? And surprisingly, international companies are also worrying about this. These 2 companies I'm sitting on in Chile, their major shareholder is OTPP in Canada. So of course, they are very much concerned on that.
Yeah, I'll start and then Joe or Ayana, if you want to jump in, is, so first of all, you're right to be confused. I'm going to say this wrong, but there's so many rating agencies and so many frameworks, I'm overwhelmed. But the journey for ESG starts with a materiality assessment. And so basically you start, instead of starting from all those agencies in, you start from your company out and say, what are the most material things? I think you said in Chile, it was an energy company, right? So it's going to have a much different materiality on an ESG. Sorry?
It's water companies, but what I'm concerned is about the DNO that I'm supposed to be reviewing now and making sure that we have the correct DNOs in different countries for the different needs that we have. And on top of that, I've been approached by a VC in California to be in one of the boards. So that's why I've been attending all your sessions that, by the way, they're great. Thank you so much.
We appreciate that, unsolicited. So you start with a materiality analysis really based on what your company strategy is. Those seem to be losing on ESG, say, well, I'm for the environment, I'm for illiteracy, and so it's 1,000 points of light and they're not focused in. So like I happen to care passionately about the environment. On the company, I'll pick out one on which I serve, we can't move the needle in the environment. We barely have any, they're all working from home now. We don't even have, we have no equipment, we have no pollution, they're not even commuting. And so to pick the environment, we could do it because we like it, but we really can't move the needle. But where we can move the needle and it's strategically aligned with us, those are the things that we want to communicate and put all of our wood behind those arrows. And our investors are telling us when they screen us, they're not looking for cleanliness of water or very important things, but that we can't move a needle on, or say we give to some charity. So we pick out all the social issues. We say what are paramount for us, and then what are the adjacencies to that, and then what's really important. But we can, like for example, we picked out illiteracy, but that's something we can't help. But there are other things like health and welfare of the employees, as well as number of women that want to major in math and science. They're very related. If there's no pipeline, we can't get them. So number one is you start with a materiality analysis. Number two is then we divvied it out to the different committees. And so if you decide what is most material, then you can do the division of labor on the board. And then we consulted in the off season with our D&O broker, as well as ISS in the off season. We talk to our big investors. We don't try to manage them, but we try to understand what screens are you using. At least if we're an outlier, we want to be what's called a conscious outlier and say, look, we chose not to do this. You might ding us for it, but we don't believe that's important. We believe these things are important. So I don't know, Joe or anyone else on the call, if you guys want to offer advice to Olga, who's incredibly international on this call.
Yeah, I'm happy to give a little bit of feedback on the D&O and the international D&O side, Olga, because it's actually a pretty common occurrence that we work with Ds and Os that have many, many different hats that they wear on many different boards. And it can be pretty overwhelming, and particularly if you're joining a fund and everyone has different insurance standards. And, you know, I'll receive an email from a D&O that has, 10 D&O policies that they want us to review and say, hey, is everything okay here? And so I've had more inquiries on personal private wealth protection D&O policies in the past year than I've had in the past 10 years, because there's an increasing risk profile for international D&O risk that people are really concerned about. The public D&O market in the US is upside down. The private D&O market is upside down. And there are a lot of questions that we are fielding in and around, do I have enough coverage? And you would be surprised, most of the companies that you are working with, whether it's a fund, they have their D&O program that fills in as a protection. If it's the company itself, they'll have a D&O program. Hopefully they have a standalone Side A program that's an additional protection. And then you have your indemnification agreement and the company's assets that are behind you to protect you. But I think because of all the questions and because of all the moving parts and the different coverage terms and conditions, and also because coverage terms and conditions are currently being pulled, so there's a pullback in terms of what you used to be able to get and what you can get today, there has been an increased interest by our individual Ds and Os for having an additional layer of protection that they control, they buy, and it basically, sits as a difference in condition and drops down and covers everything that's not covered in the event that one of these things that you're involved with isn't available and you have complete control over that. So we have definitely gotten a lot more inquiries on that because of the concerns that you have, Olga, because it is very difficult to manage all of the directors and officers insurance that potentially could be protecting you.
Thank you.
Great. You're welcome. So anyone else want to share best practices or have any questions before we start to wind down? I'm sure some of you have great advice for us. Yeah, Kim, do you want to mention?
I just had one other question for
Please.
Ayana. I'm curious what the journey was to what sounds like a really excellent set of practices and things that have been put into place for the board you've been talking about. Where did the leadership come from? If you can talk about that, I'm curious if it was the culture of the company when the company was created, or whether it evolved there over time. I would imagine there wasn't a conversation however many years ago saying, I wonder what D&O is going to, what would change with our culture. But if that was the case, I'd be curious about that as well.
Yeah, so I would actually say it was the when there was a transition in the CEO. So when the new CEO came, that was something that he truly believed in. And so he moved the large ship in that direction.
That's excellent.
Wow, that's excellent. All right, so then in our closing time, Joe, if you gave us one piece of advice, if somebody's been on Facebook the whole time and now they put their head up, and you're going to give us one piece of advice as board directors, I'm not even going to, this D&O is like fire insurance in California now. or hurricane insurance in Florida. I'm not picking on you, but I am a little bit. But if you wanted to give us one piece of advice on how to understand D&I when it comes to D&O and how we should engage with you and what you're going to be looking for, what would it be?
Yeah, my piece of advice would be this, don't just meet the metrics at the very top to slot somebody in to fill that diversity deficit. Make sure that the reason that's happening is because of a much larger interest that you have as a company in addressing these issues. And so that when you are meeting those metrics, it's a manifestation of something that's much bigger. And I think that just says so much about what your company can do and where your company can go and what you can actually negotiate in the market. And an underwriter will see that and it will be known when you go to negotiate your insurance.
All right, so what I wrote down is if it's a checkbox exercise, you'll be able to sniff it out, is what I heard from that. Is if it isn't real, don't try to fool you. Well, Ayan, before I go to you, there's another question from Shelley. Do you want to ask your question, Shelley?
Yes, I'm with Invitae Corporation in San Francisco. We're healthcare, somewhat technology. It's genetic testing. And we have started just recently, we're small, just started recently on ESG efforts. We have a lot of employee groups that have been formed, and they're not only Black, but it's gays, it's vets, it's, whatever, people of Hispanic descent. And our board is reflecting some of that, but does not have somebody who is Black on it. I guess I'm a little concerned about a mismatch between, trying so hard just in one constituency versus saying all of the rest of these are important too for diversity of thought and diversity of background. So I wonder how we think about managing that, especially in a place like California, where it may be more about people's sexual orientation and such.
Shelley, for me, that last part of the question dropped a bit. Everyone else is nodding as well. Can you please, the last part of the question?
Sorry. If we're trying to match employees, I don't know if you can hear me now. If we're trying
Yes,
to
now
match
we can. Yeah.
employees along with boards, along with, making sure that we're in sync on those. There are other constituencies that are also very important internally, and we haven't talked a lot about that. Sexual orientation and other things that we might want to track and we might want to keep in sync. And I'm just wondering if people are tracking those also, besides just the makeup of how many Blacks or Asians or this or that do we have on our board?
Sure. I'm happy to jump in unless Ayanna or Joe.
Yeah, I think the short version is that all the constituencies matter. That's my short answer to that.
Yeah, and as a follow-up, I can give you the go-to that I've been looking at during the summer was authored by a coalition of the Black board directors, the Latinx board directors, women on corporate directors, the Pan-Asian corporate directors, and I'm sure the LGBTQ as well. So I'm sure I got all of their names wrong. I will say all underrepresented groups matter, but I also think that some groups are underrepresented less than others. And we need to, especially it's easier to find some groups than it is others. And I think now is the time for us to act. So we do walk a fine line. If my house is on fire, all houses matter, but this one might matter a little more. And I'm not trying to be flippant at all. So I think your question is great and of many board members, and we're happy to put in the follow-up. It was an authored paper from all of the groups telling boards, if you need help in getting your mind around it, these are the best practices that we recommend to diversify your board. So, I don't know if I got to the crux of it. They all do matter, but some seem to be underrepresented more than others.
Shelley, I'll also add to Nora's commentary. I've personally been doing work on these topics internally at my firm, just because I felt like I needed to participate in this. And this is going back, probably 3 or 4 years ago that I really started thinking about these things. And, so I participated in some workshops. And one of the things that I remember very clearly from the workshop was somebody saying that, equity is not equality and diversity is not equity. And I didn't really understand what that meant at that time, but I do think that does have bring some perspective on some of the things that some of the questions that you're bringing up in terms of, you're not going to get it perfectly equal on all representation and of every people of every background. But I think there is something to be said about building equity in an equitable framework within your organization that can help it perform better. And so we continue to ask questions and try to figure out, what that means and do the next right thing. And I think that as you sort of go back to your own organizations, thinking about that less, like I said, in terms of a checkbox and more of the broader systemic issue of building equity within your organizations is really will help you be successful with that.
And one other thing I want to mention, what you mentioned, employees mentioned as well. On one company I'm on, after the murder of George Floyd, the company came out publicly not condoning it and denouncing it, and then gave to historically Black colleges and universities. And some in the employee base were saying, wait a second, is that you like historically Black colleges and universities better than non-historically Black? So I think it's incumbent on us as board members as well as senior management that that will come up, and we need to be able to be articulate about it, and we need to be authentic and have answers for that, because it came up in our company, and saying that is one group more important. So it is on the mind of employees, it's on the mind of directors, and it's important for us to be able to address it. So Rich Haran, did you have your hand up, or were you?
Yeah, I did have a question.
Okay.
And it's really sort of, and probably Anya to start, but really looking at what is your communication strategy for sort of educating folks on your diversity strategy? Because it's about, authenticity, but you don't want to avoid the virtue signaling. And so how do you get this and make it authentic so that it's just not the fad of the year? So I'm kind of curious what strategies, because obviously you're successful at it, what you guys are doing.
Yeah, so one of the things is the CEO leaned into it and started with open conversations. And I won't say a list of demands, but a list of demands, and then move the needle and provided transparency on how those issues would be addressed. So it wasn't a lip service kind of thing. And they were hard conversations, right? It was like, these are hard conversations and we're not recording them, but let's have a conversation about what needs to change at the company, which I think it takes courage for a company to do that.
Right. Now part of that question is, now that you're there, how do you advertise it and educate, the public, non-employees, in your, proxy statements, or, taking that next level? Because there's so many companies who are attempting to do it, but they're opening themselves up to lawsuits because they're really not. So I'm just.
Yeah, so not necessarily the proxy statements, but there are, I would say, pieces, we call it marketing, where that is part of the messaging. And so, for example, the CEO will give a pitch about a new initiative and investing in, some, Black Girls Code as an example, because, the employees decided that this is what they wanted to contribute to, but being vocal about that, at least think of it more of marketing communication in that regard.
Nora, you're on mute. Nora, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Did I? Hope you didn't hear.
You're back.
So yeah,
you're back.
You the same thing I asked Joe. What would be your key takeaway if we want to be on? I call them diversity elite companies like you are. Is there any piece of advice that you'd give us before we close this out?
Yeah, don't wait on the lawsuits. Lean into the change. That's it.
That's excellent. That's really excellent. One thing I'll mention, some boards may not know where to start. I found on one board, we started to look at the criteria. There's a whole plethora of awards for best places for technical women to work, best places for LGBTQ to work, best places. So there's awards, and it's not about the award itself. It was about the journey on what are the questions that the best wheel makers do. So that was one exercise we did as a board, and we realized how woefully inadequate we were and how outdated our thinking was. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Kim Box, our esteemed chair of the Northern California NACD, before we close the session out. But I do want to thank Joe and Dr. Howard. You guys were fabulous today. Kim?
Thanks, Nora. And again, thank you, Joe and Dr. Howard. This has just been a really, really great session. I've learned a lot of things. I've written a lot of notes, and as usual, and great parting comments from you, Nora, as well as as well as the moderating. This has just been excellent. So I just want to thank everyone again for spending the time with us today. And also, we have a couple of really great VRTs coming up. One on the board culture and COVID-19. What is the board to do? Which is November 5th. And then on November 12th, we have another one, the business case for inclusion and executive compensation, which I think will be very interesting as well. So hope to see you there, and please fill out the survey so we can keep improving and giving you the programs that you desire. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone. Speakers, if you want to stay on for a moment. Good to see you.